Through the Eyes of the Hurricane by Impossible Numbers. Every pony knows that the Earth ponies grow the food. They're the only ones who can. The unicorns botch it up if they try, and the Pegasi, well, we have our talents in other areas. However, the Pegasus Empire was made possible by one rather shrewd observation. Just because the Earth ponies grow the food doesn't mean they can control it. An Earth pony can kick a Pegasus through a row of tree trunks, but only if the Pegasus in question is dumb enough to hover next to him for long enough. Usually the Pegasus is high above and trying to pluck him from the ground, dive bomb his face, drop rocks on his head, or make the clouds shoot lightning. After that, the Pegasus can go in and pick his carriage while the poor stallion lies in a daze nearby, groaning into the soil with his rump lightly smoking. The unicorns had realized long ago that their own magic could be put to roughly the same use, and most of our history together revolved around which of the two tribes would control the third. Sometimes the unicorns got lucky. Most of the time the Pegasi were in control. Pteryx, the earth pony town on the border of our empire, was the latest victim in a tug-of-war that had been going on for centuries. I was merely a captain of the Pegasus army at the time, and anti-Pegasus sentiments were turning sour. None of the Earth ponies had the guts to raise a rebellion, so they took it out on the Pegasi lower down the food chain. If a Pegasus civilian wandered alone through the marketplace, they were likely to find shops closing all around them, with the owners peeking through gaps in the shutters and doors until the offending civilian moved on. Military cadets were quickly snapped up as local police officers. This had the advantage of giving the army something to do, and it also kept the iron hoof pounding down on the recent outbreaks of riots. Nothing major, just a few spats here and there. I was one of the first ones they called in when the authorities began getting desperate. As a Pegasus and a low-ranking grunt in the army, I was a favorite target for baiters. When I was galloping in pursuit of an apple thief, most of the crowd around me closed ranks, and some of the sprightlier youth tripped me up. Twice I was snared in the line of duty by a banner. Both times they were deliberately lowered when I attempted a flyby. Another favorite tactic of theirs was to stop me and ask for directions, whereupon a nearby troublemaker would push a stacked tower of barrels or boxes. Then they'd watch me squirm under the wreckage. I was disabled for 2 weeks after one such accident, when a falling crate was smashed my wing in the wrong place and left its bony support crippled. In my 3rd month on the streets, the constant snickering snipes and pestering pranks were getting badly on my nerves. At the time, I had been serving alongside Sergeant Pansy. She reassured me that the Earth pony insults were not meant personally, and that all of this was just anger at the actions of our higher-ups back in Pegasopolis, and that we were already really ponies in sisterhood. Pansy wasn't cut out for the military life. On paper, she sounded like the first who'd get kicked out of the army. She had a soft-spoken voice instead of the usual drill sergeant shout most of us had. She squealed at the scary-looking clouds. Give her a pike and straw mare, and the worst she'd do was poke herself in the eye. Every soldier gets nerves right before a battle, but in Pansy's case, she got a whole nervous system and refused to let it go. Yet, in a strange way, we came to like her having her around. When a soldier was down, she would walk through a raging battle to drag him to safety. Pegasi who chewed metal bolts for dares would ask Pansy for tips on how to write letters for their moms back home. Once I went into the public bath steam room, and I'm sure I walked in on a Pegasus mare confiding to Pansy about their own nightmares. Pansy has also kept the bunk nice and tidy. I don't know how best to describe how I felt the first time I saw that side of her. I and a few others of our troop were coming back from a long battle, with mud all over our faces, scorch marks on our tails, and a lot of battered armor, and a fervent desire to wash the worst memories out of our heads. There was something about opening the door and seeing clean sheets and cups of water on each of our bedsides, and smelling the baked bread from the neighboring kitchen, and hearing the few gentle notes of some old forgotten song as Pansy flitted from oven to table. It did something to a weary soldier. It wasn't enough to get Pansy out of her usual duties, though. A Pegasus who could cook a decent meal still needed to prove herself in battle, or she was dead weight. I was hoping for her time in Pteryx would help her to pony up. Still, I was young then, and I took her words to heart. I'd already made up my mind that the expansion of the Pegasus Empire was a mistake. The sooner we withdrew and gave the Earth ponies whatever their due, the better. During my early days on the street, I saw plenty of what holding down the Earth. I saw quite plainly what holding down the Earth ponies and monopolizing their food meant. Many homes were boarded up, and their occupants having long since been cast out into the streets to beg. You saw more Pegasus guards around these days, trying to stamp harder on any protest bubbling beneath the surface. Stalls began to dry up, and markets swarmed with ragged faces trying to haggle desperately for whatever crumbs the Pegasi had left for them. We Pegasi were pretty well fed and plump by comparison with our Earth pony neighbors. When I'd last seen him, the commander had also been so obese that it was hard not to think he was rubbing it in our faces. And when he wasn't around, we called him the Fat Commander. Even then, though, we whispered it. He walked through the main street towards the palace, between the rows of Pegasi officers. I was amongst the front row. He was surrounded by a private squad of elite Pegasurgers, officers so crazy that merely looking at them was a test of nerve. There was a stranger that had come up at me for a moment, and, in a whisper, if she valued her life, asked me which one was the commander. She would be quite justified in wondering why the fat one was considered a better officer material than the dozens of fitter, leaner, meaner-looking monsters marching on each side of them. If I had been a civilian and not a captain, I'd probably have sent a message to the Fat Commander of the Empire. I'd have urged him to learn from the unrest, and to hightail it out of here while we still had some credibility. There were already rumors and stories going around about the Fat Commander's sanity, none of them flattering. In fact, many of the details were so spot on that it was hard not to think of them as evidence of a spy network. However, the Pegasus creed is never to talk back to a superior officer. A captain, no matter how ripe for promotion her commanding officer thinks she is, would never do anything in favor by protesting. A captain who would just get banished and replaced by someone less imaginative. All I knew at the time was how confused I felt sometimes. A terrible thing for a growing Pegasus. I would quite like to have kicked the incumbent commander hard in the jaw for what he was doing. Yet I couldn't help feeling some resentment for the constant swipes I was getting from the very ponies I felt sorry for. On a really bad day, if I'd been asked to lead the charge against the pie-throwing Earth ponies on the street, I would have done so with a grim pleasure. It was only Pansy's hoof on my wither that stopped me from kicking the worst troublemakers in the middle of the next year. Like I said, I was young. Even after I'd outgrown my naivety, Pansy had outgrown hers. Had yet to outgrow hers. This was probably why she was demoted to a private long after all this business in Pteryx had passed. Neither of us, strictly speaking, should have been allowed to communicate about political matters within the town's walls, but we were holed up together for a long time. Our patrols always coincided. I was dying for someone to voice my frustrations to. Politics wasn't a Pegasus concern. At least, it wasn't until you were high enough in rank to get your own temple. You couldn't even have any part in the political process until your temple was on the same cloud as the Fat Commander's. Our Pegasus Empire was dying, but from where I was standing, it looked like it was the one doing the killing. It was like a manticore in its prime. My role in its later attempted re-expansion, especially during the Wendigo incident, had yet to pass. In fact, I was such a sad sack at the time that any gambler wanted to wager on the next decade's commander would quite rightly have stuck me at the bottom of the table, if they had remembered to put me on at all. It was all this politics business. I was wet behind the ears, and though I'd been in a few battles, I never saw the big picture. The only reason I had such a simple, wide-eyed view of things was that I had only Pansy to discuss them with. She was the only pony who would have been deliberately ignored by the gamblers on the aforementioned next commander bet. Yet an incident on one otherwise uneventful day, a month after the Fat Commander's visit to Pteryx, gave me a strong wake-up call as to why the politics mattered so much. If I can trace my rise to the top to any specific event, I'd pick this one. Early one morning, Corporal Cirrus came directly to my bunker and said that a dragon was ravaging the marketplace. Then he went and dived under the bunk bed, which was a mite unfortunate, as that was where Pansy was sleeping. It took a while to calm her down and stop her from trying to wrap herself around my head. Cirrus wasn't about crying wolf or prank. I nearly had him court-martialed once for frightening Sergeant Pansy over rampaging cockatrice. Well, I say cockatrice, but on closer inspection it turned out to be a badly painted peacock. Still, I decided to see what all the fuss was about, so I went out as if on a routine patrol. I took my armor. It wouldn't have been much protection against the dragon, it being used mostly to stop an enemy pony from bucking my kidneys out through my skull, but wearing it was a standard practice. Besides, you're only thought of as an idiot if you take on a monster without protection. Monstrous creatures were all the rage in these days. There was nothing unusual about one rampaging through the town. In the last month alone, I'd had to deal with a Gorgon's horse, a pony tower, and a plague of big birds with steel feathers and bronze claws. A dragon was a new one, though. They generally saw nothing worth in stealing them from us. Most of them were hidden in the mountains, hibernating through the blizzards. Quite a few earth ponies stopped me as I cantered through the streets. They told me all about the dragon that was in that accusatory tone that makes the question, "What are you going to do about it?" so darn annoying. It wasn't a mature dragon, as I had thought, but a young one. It was one of those unicorn pets that they used as yardsticks for social status. I cursed under my breath. Clearly, the unicorns from the next town along had been invited to Pteryx to negotiate something or other. Sometimes, unicorns and Pegasus got stuck in a stalemate, and ambassadors would all be called in by both sides, and try and smile and sweet-talk their way into convincing the other side that it had all been a ghastly mistake. Just a little misunderstanding. Sorry about the Battle of Unitopia, and all that, etc. I couldn't stand ambassadors. Not even Pegasi ones. Everyone knew they were just there to keep up the smiles until the stalemate broke. This could last for weeks, like a well-spun court case, and one of the unicorns had felt quite at ease letting his pet off the leash while he worked. I really couldn't stand the ambassadors who left their dumb pets off the leash. I soon found a promising trail, and my first smashed stall in a month. Despite their reputations, the previous monsters had done surprisingly little property damage during their attacks. A stall owner was trying to buck a pile of shattered planks back into shape. Whatever he'd been selling, the dragon had cleared his stock out, so he must have had something good on him. He shouted several threats, some directed at the dragon, and kicked its standing wooden block across the street to make his point. Earth Pony has some strength, yet even an Earth Pony stallion was defenseless against a fully grown dragon, and in the meantime, the Pegasus riot police were having trouble just keeping up with it. I followed the trail of smashed stalls, gorged buildings, and burning wooden frames, galloping along the ground to conserve wing power for later. It was hard to see what I could do against it, but I'd been told to deal with the disturbances, and from what I could tell, the whole town was getting seriously disturbed. Footprints large enough for a pony to curl up in guided me through from street to street, and sometimes a coin or a gem could be seen along the trail. Eventually I got caught up with the riot police, who had stopped and were debating with themselves whether to fly overhead or search the ground. The trail of footprints had vanished, and we were stuck between two high walls with a double row of abandoned stalls. There was a too long gap between the prints and the end of the road, and no sign of footprints further ahead, which would have betrayed a leap. A flying dragon, just what we didn't need. Pegasus riot police are not built for speed, and chase had left them tired. Pansy had caught up with us, torn between her devotion to duty and her desire not to get cremated prematurely. So we agreed to do a flyby and let the police catch up with us later. I remembered how the cloud-saturated sky was that day, as though the weather teams were preparing to make this ordeal more intense than it should have been. We began with a simple ascent to try and get a full view of the town, but I hated flying straight up. It's not as pleasant a business as we sometimes make it out to be. I went to fly too high too fast, and my ears popped with a stab of pain from each one. I felt that horrible sensation that was like my head was getting pinched. It was a relief that we both came down low and began scanning district after district. The dragon had, at some point, landed and hidden itself amongst the labyrinth street, crossing and crisscrossing each other. Crowds were still out. It was a busy market. Ponies looked up and openly mocked us, or at least that's what it sounded from up high. I'd learned how to block out such sounds by now, but Pansy still hadn't gotten used to it. As far as Pegasus upbringing went, she had it soft. I'd learned a few weeks into the job that she hadn't been submitted to the Hillop test like the rest of us had been. Her parents had belonged to some weird sub-community that favored nurture over torture, a purely alien concept to most Pegasus parents at the time. Being left on the hillside overnight to see how a foal coped was pretty tame stuff compared to the drills and disciplines that soon followed, and somehow Pansy had been unlucky enough, I would have said back then, to have avoided all that. It was still a mystery to me how she'd ended up in my army. Since we weren't having any luck, and it was already raining, I had dived for the streets. Pansy got the hint and soared after me. I settled for a place a couple of blocks from where we'd taken off, as the crowds were in full flow, and one of the ponies must have seen it rise up. Each time we asked a bystander to help us locate the dragon, we never got a straight answer. Some said it had alighted on a corner, while some had said it landed not too far from here. Others swore blind that they'd seen it head over to the other side of town, north, east, south and west. All were giving answers to the question, which way? Even the ones who gave consistent directions had a tendency to point us in any direction save for the one they just described. A minority denied that there was even a dragon at all, insisting that I was merely getting worked up over a gold-obsessed giant chicken, or that it was actually nothing at all, and just my imagination, a glimpse into another world, or that I'd eaten something really bad the night before. After a few minutes of this, I was quite content to simply fly back to the bunker and let the citizenry deal with the dragon. I would have done it too if Pansy hadn't spoken up. She heard some calling, she said, from the next street along, and as one we hurried over, flying over the crowds when it became too obstructive. We came out onto a street that was clear, except for 3 ponies huddled around something in the middle of the road. Further along, I saw the glimmer of a fallen sapphire in the dirt, and as we glided closer, we could see that the impression of the dragon claws deep in the mud, like an illusion revealing itself. They started near the 3 ponies, and I suspected for a moment that the bystanders were stealing loot. I crashed into them, knocking 2 of them aside, and stood straight up to deliver a lecture before I had to shriek of the pain. I looked down and saw a broken leg lying before my hooves. Besides me, Pansy nearly vomited at the sight. The leg was attached to a stallion, though only just. It was half buried in the mud, and appeared either unwilling or unable to move. He was the first earth pony I'd seen without rags or clothes, and his bony body made him look far older than he really was. The dragon's foot had probably stuck to any cloth he'd worn, and torn it off when the foot was lifted. The 3 bystanders were nearly in hysterics. From what they were saying, they'd fled at the sight of the dragon, but their father, the one who was currently trapped in a footprint bigger than his own body, had not seen it in time. The dragon had landed on all 4s, which was a small mercy that distributed the weight. But all the same, you didn't get out of that situation without something to remember it by. The pony was lucky it had only been his leg. As soon as I heard this account, I sent Pansy to a nearby doctor's house to send a team down for this pony. I wanted to go after the dragon, but bystanders were on the verge of pulling their fallen loved one from the footprint, and I hastily stepped in. They were more likely to harm him than help him, and I told them so outright. At least he was still breathing and conscious. To this day, I sense that the only reason they desisted was I was in uniform, and, to them, one of the military overlords. A Pegasus civilian would have been bucked for such an outrage. Pansy came back pretty quickly. It was a Pegasus establishment, and the doctors were unwilling to come out for an earth pony. I sent her back, this time with a strong worded message. On any other matter, this animosity might have been just another burden to stomach, but when you're looking at the pony who's lying in the mud screaming for what's left of his leg, you don't put up with any horse of offal from any pony. When she came back, a team of doctors came with her. With the casualty recovered, I went ahead, Pansy hurrying after me. We were on wings now. Speed was essential to cover for lost grounds. In any case, I was working myself up for the big moment coming up. As we went along, a group of civilian Pegasi caught up with us and told us that the dragon had made a beeline for the palace. They weren't the only ponies following us. Word had gotten around, doubtless since we stopped to ask for directions, and the whole marketplace got up and moved like a caravan behind us, muttering amongst themselves. Some were shouting excitedly that we were going to fight the dragon. I cursed them under my breath. Most of them, as far as I could tell from the snatches I heard, were looking forward to seeing a Pegasus getting char-grilled. Pansy was still showing insecurity, her inexperience. The idea of a dragon wanting to burn her to a cinder was enough to make her turn white. But by the time we reached the palace gates, we'd listened to the cheers of the crowd behind us, and they definitely wanted to see us burned to a cinder. Pansy was shaking so badly that I was worried she'd faint or fall out of the sky. The sight of her losing her nerve made me feel uneasy. I had no intention of letting her get close to the dragon. She was only tagging along because I felt better for having a witness who wouldn't groan in disappointment if I survived. I was just hoping that she'd have enough sense to leave it to the riot police if I failed. Pansy had a weakness for trying to save the fallen comrades in the middle of battle, which was weird to the high command. Their view was that being recognized for falling in battle was nothing less than a posthumous badge of honor. I soared over the gates, feeling like a complete fool, and I told Pansy to hang back at the watchtower. It was deserted, which was probably just as well, as the only Pegasi washouts were assigned guard duty on the tower. They'd be next to useless in a brawl. Beneath me were the slopes of the grassy hill, and looming before me was the palace, a set of granite block towers. The dragon had touched down in one of the towers. It had its back turned to me, but its wings were tucked in, and the slates being thrown off on either side of it gave me enough clues. It was beginning to tear through the conical roof to get to the chamber inside. Goodness knows how the ambassador would react when he found out that his pet had become a house-sized monster overnight. He probably wouldn't care beyond the short-term inconvenience it would cost him, dealing with us street-level grunts. My blood boiled at the thought. We had to clean up his mess. To cap it all, unicorns had the annoying tendency to try and bribe their way out of almost any scrape during a peacetime. The dragon was large, even when it hadn't fully grown yet. That left it with a set of jaws capable of snapping me up whole, so that I wasn't about to charge in. Instead, I flew closer until I was nearly perching on its tail. From there, I could see the bulging cheeks and the dribbles of golden chains on either side of its mouth. I decided not to get any closer until I had a plan worked out. Even with its mouth full and its flame thus averted, the dragon was still capable of killing me. As soon as I noticed as soon as it noticed me this close, I would forget what it was doing and try to swat me out of the air. It might not even stop there. Now, I hated with double vigor its ability to fly. Had it been a run-of-the-mill ground dragon, I could have defeated it simply by making it lose its balance and fall off. I still had the image of the crushed pony and Pansy's terrified face in my head. I hung back, wondering if it was best to go through with the job. The dragon was now unloading its collected gold into the hole it had made, and once it had done so, it would probably be content to sit tight and bother no pony else. While it was on the tower, there would be no real danger unless it made the tower collapse. A tower this sturdy needed at least 10,000 years of erosion before it would even be weak enough to collapse. The unicorns were still inside within the palace grounds, and would learn sooner or later about the monster's doings. One of them might be competent enough to get it down and change it back to normal. However I looked at it, it was just pointlessly wasting time. I looked back at the gates, seeing a crowd of spectators growing. I could simply have turned around, folded up my wings, and started the long trek back to the bunker, but the crowd were having none of it. The intensity of their combined will was horrible. I've seen ranks and ranks of enemies swarming from the horizon to the horizon all around me. I've seen armies as vast as the seas roar and close like tidal waves. I've seen skies blackened with the wings of 1,000 Pegasi, yet at least then I'd have always had my hoofs full kicking them down one at a time. If I fell, my comrades would have cheered for me and sung a noble eulogy in my memory. All I could see now was a crowd of sneering civilians watching my every move. They were already falling silent, having made their bets and worked themselves up into believing they were about to witness a real treat. They wouldn't have been there at all if I had been an earth pony, yet a pair of wings and no choice over my parenting, and suddenly I was a classic entertainment. They'd be telling this to the children, and it'd be known by every pony that I'd ever met before sundown. It was terrible enough thinking what they would say if I was wounded. It was worse still to wonder what they'd say if they saw me reduced to a sad little pile of ashes. They'd have no control over what they did with my I'd have no control over what they did with my reputation then. Pansy hovered between me and them. I wondered how many were actually seeing her. The idea was that she'd been alone, despite the crowd. When she saw me go up against the dragon was a shock. It was unthinkable. No, one way or the other I was going to take it on. And if I was taking it on, then I'd have to win, or at least not lose too badly. I tightened the muscles within my wings. It wasn't enough to change my flight trajectory, but enough to prepare for a change, and rose silently behind the dragon. Common sense told me to flee, and let the matter sort itself out, but a Pegasus never flees, and I was starting to see options coming up. That was probably when it hit me. Eureka moments are not moments at all, and can't be defined by an arbitrary point on your life's timeline. But if I had to date it, I'd say that something probably occurred to me around then. I was military, through and through. I wasn't going to flee, but not because the crowd wanted me to stay, and not because I enjoyed the thought of being a reckless idiot. I wasn't going to flee because I was born to treat fighting as the highest of high arts. And if I thought I had a chance of winning, nothing was going to deny me the pleasure of a good fight. I'd have a crack at it. If it proved too much, I could always go for the strategic retreat. I rose higher, readying myself for the dive. I couldn't kick hard enough to hurt it at normal speed, but with some momentum built up in my body, I'd give the dragon something to think about. The ponies in the crowd were now completely silent. For a moment, I wondered how the dragon could not notice the change in sound. I could hear it clearly over this distance. The ponies were going to remember without fail what happened next. Despite the familiar pains I had to endure throughout my ascent, I was pumping with a wonderful sense of anticipation. I'd show those ponies a thing or two. I had my target identified. The dragon was nicely relaxed now, perfect for me to get a shot off. I built up speed, and then I did a quick U-turn and propelled myself straight towards the ground, breaking through the G-forces under sheer willpower and a mounting sense of bliss. It took a while for my vision of the dragon to show any sign that I was getting closer. I'd covered a lot of air, but once it started, it seemed to jump straight onto the other extreme, and my vision was full of the dragon almost immediately. I tore into the membrane with a satisfying slash and changed the direction immediately, heading out of the town's rooftops. The dragon's wing was jerked back, ripping the beast, which was caught by surprise, clean off the tower. It roared in alarm, and I was suddenly encumbered by the sheer weight that I was dragging through the air. Dragon wings rely on innate draconic magic to get around the more burdensome gravitational physics. Otherwise they are, when you get down to it, two big leathery capes. It tried to flap. I could see it pulling through the membrane wrapped around me, and only managed to entangle itself further. I tried pushing the speed a little more. He suddenly fell loose. I changed course again, wrenching both of us directly upwards. At least, I hoped so. The membrane covered my face, and I could only tell where I was going from memory. Having been up already, I never had a pop in my ears to confirm it. My plan started to fall apart once the dragon regained its senses. Up until then, I'd relied on its being too surprised to respond. With a jerk, its wings whipped off my face, and I was thrown tumbling into an eddy. For a fleeting moment, I was expecting a brief flash of heat to engulf me. I steadied myself, flipping around, and tried to build up momentum again. The dragon was a mess. It was trying valiantly to flap, fighting against the tumbling of its own body. Despite the amount of time it had enjoyed getting used to its sub-adult form, the dragon hadn't much practiced on the wing. I tackled it in the chest and pushed down. I couldn't see the ground. The air howled like a car approaching its climactic finish. At any moment, I was expecting to strike earth and shatter every bone in my body. To my shame, I turned chicken at that point. Both wings came out, and I stopped to hover in mid-air. I left the dragon shooting downwards under our joint momentum. The impact knocked down 2 buildings either side of the street. For a moment, it was lost amid a cloud of dust. And before the cloud cleared away, I could see its body sprawled across the street. To my horror, it was on the main avenue that had landed dangerously close to the back of the crowd. After what seemed like a long time, the last of the dust settled. The dragon's mouth was wide open, and it was frowning as if in the middle of a protest against its treatment. Every limb was bent wherever there was a joint, at the knee, the wrist, the elbow, along its claws, and even the wings looked like they were folding up wherever possible. I landed next to its head. The eyes were closed, though whether it was unconsciousness or because it was dead I couldn't tell. I simply stood next to it, watching in case a muscle twitched. The crowd was already galloping up the road to take a closer look. Most of my morning was spent simply watching the mob thinking at work. They were breathing very calmly, with steadying breaths. Many were gaping. It was clear that they had never seen a Pegasus fighting anything larger than another pony, up close or at a distance. I was pleased to see I was commanding respect now. I waited for a long time for them to disperse, but they didn't. Finally, sensing that I wasn't about to be troubled for a while, I sat down and waited for Sergeant Pansy to catch up. She landed next to me and pawed the ground. Strangely, she was as quiet as the rest of them, and to my surprise, seemed reluctant to talk whenever I made an observation about the dragon or told her what was going to happen next. She didn't make eye contact. Even she hadn't predicted that I'd win, but I had expected to be seized in a hug so relieved to come out that the joy dammed up behind it was enough for a party and an all-nighter. It took me some time to realize that she was scared of me. The crowd was trickling away, slowly at first. I noticed that none of them went up the road if it meant passing close to me, and even the ones who went the other way did so with a hypnotic stare back, as though terrified I would follow them. This was new, even amongst Pegasi. I had so far shown no skills out of the ordinary. Faces that would otherwise have mocked or ridiculed me were now pretending very hard that they had never even acknowledged my existence, and indeed were trying so hard that the lack of attention was in itself a kind of acknowledgement. It seemed curious that this was the first reaction I'd get for essentially doing what they'd have expected me to do. Indeed, for what was expected of me as a military pony. I had worked something out around the time the last of them went, and by then I had nothing else to look at except for the dragon, which wasn't dead. Its chest was rising and falling, and once in a while a faint wisp of smoke puffed out of a nostril. By lunchtime, no pony seemed to be coming, not even the riot police, and I was tired with the delay. I sent Pansy off to bring a squad here to supervise the beast, and then they'd have to repeat the order loudly when she didn't move. It wasn't a long wait after that. Clearly, she had been in a hurry not to disappoint me. The squad came soaring overhead. One or two of the guards landed next to me and began asking questions, mostly along the lines of what the hell just happened and was Pansy telling the truth. I wasn't in the mood, so I rattled off a few answers and left. I swear that I saw the dragon half open an eyelid as I went past, as if to check I was really going. I heard later that the dragon was pretty compliant, and soon shrunk down and reunited with its owner. The Pegasi had difficulty persuading the unicorn ambassador that I'd done what I'd done. To be honest, they'd have had difficulty persuading me, and I'd have been the one who had done it. Pansy told me the next morning that nearly every pony outside of the town for 3 miles around knew what happened. It was then that I understood why the fat commander insisted on the expansion. It wasn't the land, he claimed, that made it worth it. A quick look at how poorly managed Pteryx could dispel the notion like lightning, but the conquest itself. There was no pleasure in having conquered. There was little to be gained from getting hoof to hoof with the powerful unicorns. Yet something had yearned in him to perform greatness, and what better testament than conquest? For a fleeting time in my life I felt respect for him. Taking on the dragon, I had seen and felt exactly what he must have experienced. It was intoxicating. Several days later, this stalemate finally broke. Trouble was brewing closer to Pegasopolis, and the fat commander was losing interest in the Earth Pony town, which in any case he'd been holding down by the tip of his hoof. He was going to withdraw his troops from Pteryx. Though we didn't know it at the time, that was the start of the Empire's decline. Despite what I'd led myself to believe, I felt it as a bitter blow. We were supposed to be tougher than that. To Pansy's horror, and to my horror too, in retrospect, I actually pined for the old commander, the one I'd hated most of my time in the streets of Pteryx. There wasn't much to say about this replacement. Some ponies are just placeholders in the history books, and the new commander was a pretty nondescript mare who did her job, and who would do her job until some pony more suitable could be found. Soon after the news came through, I was given a recommendation by my commanding officer, and thus would begin my ascent to the commander's position. I felt strangely calm about my first promotion. It was as though it was obvious it would happen, even natural. Pansy went in the other direction. This also seemed natural. I started to look down on her. She was not cut out for the demands of a position of authority, for greatness. I kept her close all the same. Despite the dragon incident, we still had several months of plodding through the streets behind us, and a lot more had happened since then that only strengthened it. Strength became my watchword for nearly the rest of my stay in Pteryx. I'd shown it, and the fat commander, before his withdrawal, had shown it. I suspected, on my better days, when I was feeling more kindly disposed, that Pansy had a strength of her own too. For the life of me, I couldn't tell what it was. I often went into moods like this. Ever since my promotion, I was physically giddy with the prospect of gaining more power. I remembered my last day in the town, when the bad news came through, and I sought one last walk through the streets before we were to pull out. Pansy came with me, having recently been demoted to corporal for trying to comfort a young criminal she was supposed to be incarcerating. There are so many petty thieves targeting food stalls these days that soon we'd have to send them to another town's prison. I never learned the full details, but I was briefly brought out of my power fantasies and reminded of my former self. I felt outraged. It was the fat commander's fault all over again. The food monopoly hadn't yet been broken. I was seeing evidence of this all over the streets. Earth ponies were thinning. To my surprise, many Pegasi were feeling the brunt too. Any pony who wasn't military was having their food rations cut down to resupply the troops. It wasn't long after this that the fat captain lost all respect among his peers and was ousted. Pansy and I went along the marketplace, silently living out our last few hours in the town. There wasn't much to see that wasn't already etched deeply into our minds, so we felt more like we were checking off a list and evoking fine memories. We came upon the food stalls, most of which were nearly empty. Whether this was due to an early rush buying up stocks or due to lack of stock to begin with, I couldn't say. Either seemed plausible. A pair of earth ponies lingered around the apple stall, eyeing the red fruit. Perhaps they were contemplating theft. Perhaps they were simply trying to slake their hunger by feeding their eyes. Or perhaps the sight of food was just too distracting for them to pass it without taking time to gaze. My old sympathies for the disheveled ponies of the town came back to me, but more out of habit than out of any hope I could help. For once, I felt powerless. It was a sharp antidote to the puffed-up attitude I'd indulged ever since facing that dragon. Pansy then went ahead and did sort of the thing that got her demoted later on. This was also the reason I wanted her close when I became a commander. Without a word, she walked up to the stall owner and bought 2 apples. I had expected one for me and one for her, but instead she walked over to the pair, offered her purchase to them. They looked stunned, almost frightened, and I fully expected them to turn tail and bolt. They reached out gingerly, and I could see them looking for hidden irons, waiting for Pansy to clap them over their pasterns and pull them along by the chains. They held out their hooves until they were nearly touching hers, but dared not to come closer. Pansy tipped the apples into their hooves and smiled encouragingly, like a teacher to a pair of students making breakthroughs. I don't think the pair knew what they were doing throughout the entire ordeal. Receiving an apple each from one of their sworn oppressors just didn't figure into their worldview, and I couldn't blame them for still trying to find a trick. They ate the apples in the end, though, greedily, hastily, and noisily. We passed on, catching up on our patrol route. When I looked back, they were staring after us. I don't remember what Pansy and I talked about after we left the marketplace, though we never mentioned the incident with the apples. Truth be told, I suspected Pansy was slightly embarrassed about it. She tended to blush a lot if I began to frame a question with the word "why." I could certainly see why she'd kept mute when we joined the rest of the Pegasi at the bunker for the last lunch. The others would have ripped into her if they'd known she'd wasted money on earth ponies. They would have called her a soft heart. To her, I suppose, facing them would have been much like facing a dragon. If I could pick an incident that started my rise to the top, it would have been the dragon incident. If I could pick an incident that kept me from taking the previous commander's path, however, well, I guess it would have been this one. The end.